Osceola never lost a battle. In 7 years of war against the most powerful army on the continent, no American officer ever defeated him in the field. And yet he died a prisoner in a foreign fort, 300 miles from the swamps he had spent his life defending, captured not by superior tactics, not by superior numbers, but by a piece of white cloth. Before this story ends, a general of the United States Army will be condemned by his own Congress. A newspaper editor 3 states away will call the flag of truce a lie wrapped in linen. And a Seminole warrior who could not be beaten will be brought down by the one weapon no strategist ever accounts for: the word of an enemy who never intended to keep it. What happened in the pine scrub south of St. Augustine on an October morning in 1837 would end a war leader's freedom and begin something else entirely, something stranger, something that outlasted his death by decades and turned his own skull into an artifact. That part comes later. It has to, because to understand how something impossible like this happens, it is necessary to understand exactly how large, how confident, and how certain of victory the empire chasing him actually was. If you find value in cases like this one, where history's official record and its buried footnotes tell 2 very different stories, subscribe now. There is more coming, and it rewards people who stay for all of it. By 1835, the United States Army was not a force that lost wars. It had defeated the British twice. It had crushed Tecumseh's Confederacy in the Northwest. It had broken the Red Stick Creek Nation at Horseshoe Bend in 1814, a battle so total that Andrew Jackson forced the survivors to cede 23 million acres of land in a single treaty. Against the Seminole people of Florida, fewer than 5,000 men, women, and children scattered across swamp, hammock, and coastal scrub, Washington expected a formality. This is a story of how that formality became the longest, costliest, and deadliest war the United States ever fought against a native nation. And it is the story of how a man who was never even a hereditary chief, a man born Billy Powell, to a Creek mother and a Scottish trader father in a town called Tallahassee, in what is now Alabama, became the single figure the U.S. Army feared enough to break its own laws of war to stop. The thesis is simple, and it is worth stating plainly before the details accumulate. Osceola could not be defeated by the United States Army. So the United States Army decided he would not be defeated at all. He would simply be taken. To understand the scale of what Osceola resisted, it helps to understand what preceded him. His family were Red Stick refugees, the defeated faction of the Creek War of 1813 to 1814, driven out of Alabama after Jackson's victory, who fled south into Spanish Florida and were absorbed into the loose confederation of bands, villages, and escaped slave communities that Americans called, collectively, the Seminole. Osceola was 10 years old when his mother carried him into that new world. He grew up watching his adopted people lose land in increments. The Treaty of Moultrie Creek in 1823, which confined the Seminole to a reservation in central Florida. Then the Treaty of Payne's Landing in 1832, which a small faction of chiefs signed under pressure, agreeing, on paper, to leave Florida entirely and relocate west of the Mississippi. Most Seminole leaders, including the senior chief Maconochie, never accepted that the treaty was legitimate. Osceola, who was not born a chief and held no hereditary claim to leadership, began to accumulate something more dangerous than a title. He accumulated followers. The Indian agent charged with enforcing removal was a man named Wiley Thompson, and the relationship between the two men curdled from cautious respect into open hatred. In 1835, after Osceola repeatedly and publicly denounced the treaty, Thompson had him arrested and held in irons at Fort King for 6 days until he agreed to sign a document accepting removal. Osceola signed. Contemporary sources do not confirm the popular legend that he stabbed the treaty with a knife in defiance. That image, repeated in countless later retellings, cannot be verified in the records of the time. What can be verified is what he did next. He kept his signature, and he kept his promise to Thompson, quietly, for months. Here is the asymmetry that defined everything that followed. The United States, at the outbreak of what would become the Second Seminole War, would eventually commit more than 30,000 men to Florida. The Seminole resistance, at its absolute peak, numbered fewer than 2,000 warriors, 30,000 against 2,000. What the U.S. Army knew was overwhelming force, artillery, naval support, and the entire logistical apparatus of a growing nation. What the U.S. Army did not know, could not know because no officer serving in Florida had ever fought a war in it, was the terrain. Florida in the 1830s was not a battlefield. It was an ecosystem actively hostile to European-style warfare. Flooded rivers with no bridges, hammocks of saw palmetto dense enough to conceal 100 armed men standing upright, swamps that swallowed supply lines and rotted boots, and bred the malaria that would eventually kill more American soldiers than Seminole bullets ever did. The Seminole did not need to defeat the U.S. Army in open battle. They needed only to make Florida cost more than Washington was willing to pay. Osceola understood this before most of his own senior chiefs did. The war began, by most accounts, on the same December morning in 2 places at once. On December 28, 1835, Osceola led a raid against Fort King itself, walking directly up to the agency building and shooting Wiley Thompson dead, along with 6 others who stood near him, a settling of the personal debt Thompson had incurred by chaining him. 25 miles south on that same morning, Major Francis Langhorne Dade was leading a column of 108 men north from Fort Brooke toward Fort King, escorting a resupply wagon and a 6-pound field cannon. Dade believed correctly that an ambush was likely at a river crossing. He was wrong about the location. 180 Seminole and Black Seminole warriors, led in part by Macanopy, lay concealed in palmetto scrub along an open pine barren where Dade had stopped posting flank scouts, because 5 days of quiet marching had lulled him into confidence. Macanopy fired the first shot himself by prearranged signal, and it killed Dade instantly. Within minutes, half the column was dead or dying. By the end of the engagement, 108 of 110 soldiers were killed. 2 survived the initial assault with severe wounds. 1 died the following day, escaping through the swamp. Osceola was not present at Dade's battle. He was busy elsewhere, closing a different account. But the timing was not coincidence. It was doctrine. Coordinated strikes, deniable absence, maximum psychological effect, not recklessness. Discipline. 3 days later, on December 31st, 1835, came the Battle of Withlacoochee, and this time Osceola commanded directly. A U.S. force of roughly 750 regulars and militia under General Duncan Clinch attempted to cross the flooded Withlacoochee River using a single leaking canoe. It was slow, it was clumsy, and it exposed the column at its most vulnerable moment. Mid-crossing, weapons wet, formation broken. An estimated 227 Seminole fighters under Osceola and a war leader named Alligator opened fire from concealed positions in the hammocks the instant the Americans committed to the bank. 4 hours of close engagement followed. Clinch would later report the battle as a tactical victory. The casualty count, somewhere between 60 and 63 American dead and wounded against a force that failed to reach or destroy a single Seminole village, told a different story to anyone reading closely. This is the moment the pattern becomes undeniable. Not a single pitched battle, not a fortunate ambush. A sustained, repeatable method. Know the terrain the enemy does not. Strike where logistics are weakest and vanish before reinforcement arrives. This is where the phrase that will define the rest of this story needs to be said plainly. This was not savagery, and it was not desperation. It was doctrine, refined, repeated, and devastatingly effective against an army trained for open field engagements in terrain it had never mapped. By the summer of 1836, an American blockhouse garrison on the Withlacoochee endured a 48-day siege, its soldiers reduced to eating their own horses and dogs to survive. General Winfield Scott, one of the most decorated commanders in American history, assembled a coordinated 3-column offensive with 5,000 men and failed to bring the Seminole to a decisive engagement even once. And here is where the cost begins to matter more than the casualty counts. According to the U.S. National Park Service's own historical accounting, for every 4 Seminole people the Army eventually managed to deport west, it lost 3 American soldiers and spent $32,000, a figure equivalent to roughly $8.5 million per deported Seminole in modern currency. Not a war, a hemorrhage. If the sheer scale of that mismatch surprises you, this channel exists for exactly this kind of history. The wars empires prefer not to remember in detail. Subscribing costs nothing, and it means the next one reaches you the moment it's ready. By 1837, command in Florida had passed to a new general, Thomas Sidney Jesup, Quartermaster General of the United States Army, a career logistics officer now tasked with ending a war his predecessors could not win by force. Jesup understood something his predecessors had refused to accept, that the Seminole could not be beaten militarily inside their own terrain. So Jesup stopped trying to win militarily. In September 1837, he had already tested the method once. A Seminole leader named King Philip had been captured, and Jesup used him as leverage, sending word to Philip's son, a rising war leader called Withlacoochee, or Wildcat, to arrange a meeting. Withlacoochee arrived under a flag of truce to negotiate his father's release. Jesup detained him on the spot. It worked. No shots fired, no casualties. One of the most capable young commanders in the Seminole resistance removed from the field entirely by paperwork rather than powder. Osceola, by this point, was already a sick man. He had contracted malaria years earlier in the swamps he had used so effectively against his enemies. The same terrain that had been his greatest asset was now slowly becoming something closer to a debt collector. What Jesup knew, and what Osceola perhaps underestimated, was exactly how much that illness had begun to change the calculation. On October 20th, 1837, Osceola sent a trusted black Seminole interpreter named Juan Caballo, also known as John Horse, to General Joseph Marion Hernandez, the militia commander at St. Augustine, requesting a meeting to discuss peace terms. It is worth sitting with that detail for a moment, because it will matter enormously in under a minute. Osceola requested the meeting. He came prepared to negotiate, not to surrender, and certainly not to be taken. Jesup's response to Hernandez was not a peace instruction. It was an order. Agree to the meeting, and when Osceola arrives, seize him. On the morning of October 21, 1837, Osceola and a fellow leader named Co-Hadjo rode out to a site roughly 8 miles south of St. Augustine, near an outpost called Fort Peyton. With them came 71 Seminole warriors, 6 women, and 4 black Seminole fighters. 75 armed men in total, all under the protection of a white flag that, by the customs of every army involved in this war, should have made them untouchable. Osceola asked for Jesup personally to come out and talk face to face. Jesup refused. He stayed inside the fort and sent Hernandez's second-in-command out to test the waters, to ask questions, gauge intentions, and report back. The answers, that officer said, were evasive, unsatisfactory. It was the excuse Jesup needed. He gave the order. Major James Ashby, backed by Hernandez and 250 mounted dragoons who had ridden out from St. Augustine that morning, moved on the Seminole party. What happened next has been documented, cross-referenced, and confirmed by multiple contemporary accounts. And the detail that historians keep returning to is this: not a single shot was fired. 75 armed warriors, capable of the ambush tactics that had just spent 2 years humiliating the United States Army in open terrain, surrendered without resistance, because resistance under a flag of truce was not something any of them had trained for, expected, or believed their enemy capable of. Osceola was taken prisoner along with his entire party, on the word of an army that had explicitly promised him safety to get him there. The reaction was not what General Jesup expected. This was not celebrated as a clean victory in Washington. It became, almost immediately, a scandal. Newspapers across the country condemned the capture as dishonorable. Members of Congress denounced Jesup by name. International press picked up the story and used it as evidence of American hypocrisy. A nation that preached the rule of law, breaking the single oldest rule of warfare there is. The flag of truce means safety. Jesup had won, and in winning this way he had also, in the court of public opinion, lost something the U.S. Army would spend years trying to recover. Osceola was marched first to Fort Marion in St. Augustine. In December, roughly 20 of his fellow prisoners scaled the walls and escaped in a single, coordinated breakout. Osceola was not among them. His body, by then, would not allow it. The malaria that had lived in him for years, combined with what doctors of the period diagnosed as severe tonsillar infection, had left him too weak to climb. As a direct consequence of that escape, the Army transferred its most valuable prisoners out of Florida entirely, moving Osceola, McCanopy, and roughly 200 other Seminole captives to Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island, South Carolina, a fortress designed quite literally to make sure this particular escape could never happen twice. At Fort Moultrie, something strange happened. Osceola became a celebrity. Charleston society, fascinated by the famous war chief the newspapers had turned into a household name, visited him by the dozens. He was permitted to walk the grounds, fish, canoe, and was even escorted to a theater performance, where, according to period accounts, the audience gave him a standing ovation. The celebrated painter George Catlin arrived and persuaded Osceola to sit for what would become the most reproduced portrait of any Seminole leader in American history. turban, ostrich plumes, silver gorget, rifle held loosely at his side, an image that still defines how the world pictures him nearly 2 centuries later. Another artist, Robert J. Curtis, painted him as well. It is one of history's colder ironies. A man imprisoned by deception was, in the same months, being immortalized by the same culture that had betrayed him. He did not have long. On January 30th, 1838, roughly 3 months after his capture, Osceola knew he was dying. He asked for his 2 wives and his children to be brought to him. He asked to be dressed in his finest war clothes. The same ornamentation, the same care and presentation that had defined him in life. He died that day, 33 or 34 years old, still officially a prisoner of war, having never once been defeated by an American soldier in open combat. What happened to his body afterward is where this story stops being simply tragic and becomes something closer to grotesque. The Army physician who had treated him at Fort Moultrie, Dr. Frederick Weedon, was present at death. Before Osceola was buried with military honors at the fort, Weedon made a plaster death mask, a common practice for prominent men of the era. Then, according to multiple independently corroborating sources, Weedon did something that was not common practice at all. He decapitated the corpse. He took the severed head back to St. Augustine, embalmed it, using a preservation method he had learned in his medical training, and kept it in his home, where, according to accounts passed down through his own family, he would place it on the bedpost of his 3 young sons as a punishment when they misbehaved. In 1843, 5 years after Osceola's death, Weedon gave the head to his son-in-law, Dr. Daniel Whitehurst, who in turn presented it as a gift to one of the most distinguished surgeons in the United States, Valentine Mott of New York, where it was placed on public display in Mott's Surgical and Pathological Museum. It remained there and later at the Medical College of New York for 27 years. Not a single photograph of it is known to exist. In 1896, a fire swept through the museum, and according to every source that has attempted to trace the head's final location, destroyed it completely. The death mask survived where the head did not. It passed through military hands and eventually entered the Smithsonian Institution's anthropology collection in 1885, where it remains today, a plaster echo of a face that could not be defeated, kept in a drawer in the same government that had once needed a lie to capture it. There is a version of this story that ends with outrage, and that outrage is not misplaced. But there is a second, quieter observation worth sitting with as this one closes. The Second Seminole War did not end with Osceola's death. It continued for another 4 years, then flared again in the 1850s, and, remarkably, a small number of Seminole people in Florida never surrendered, never signed a treaty, and never left. Their descendants live in Florida today, the only native nation in the continental United States that can make that claim. The empire that could not defeat Osceola in the field eventually could not fully defeat the people he fought for either. It won the war on paper and lost something less measurable in the process, the same something that turned a battlefield capture into a permanent stain on the record of the general who ordered it. Osceola was never beaten in battle. He was beaten by a flag that was supposed to mean the opposite of what it was used for. There is a kind of victory that cannot survive the method used to win it, and the United States Army in October of 1837 chose to find that out the hard way in the full glare of a press that would not let anyone forget. If this is the kind of history worth remembering in detail, the kind with names, dates, and consequences that outlived everyone involved, subscribing keeps these coming, and it costs nothing but a moment.